When I picked up this slab, the first thing I was told was, you'll need epoxy for that. And maybe they were right, but I was stubborn enough to do it my way. No resin, no rivers, no regrets. Well, except for the part where I punched a hole clean through the table. But we'll get to that. I've never loved the idea of pouring plastic into timber, and I've mostly been trying to sidestep the whole epoxy conversation, keeping it out of my videos where I could. But even when I didn't mention or use epoxy in my last project, half the comments were still about it. So this time, I reckon we talk about it. With this table, I want to show you why it's more rewarding to work with the flaws than to just fill them in. That said, it was a real challenge, and maybe it's not the proper way as some will have you believe, but I think the results will speak for themselves. So what I've been doing here is marking out and cutting this slab into a sort of oval shape. Usually I'd say I'm not one to work with circles and curves, but this is actually a client piece and they specifically requested an oval shaped coffee table. While I'd say it's not the sort of design that I would normally lean towards, I saw it as a good opportunity to try and test myself creatively. For me, the first step was picking a slab that would suit this shape. The one I landed on seemed to fit the bill. It has a circular burl that would really accentuate a curved design. On that note, in all my admittedly few years of woodworking, I've never actually had the chance to work with burled timber before, so I was also drawn to this slab for the extra experience it would give me. I knew this slab was going to be a nightmare, which made it an easy choice. I've got a soft spot for difficult projects. They're the best way to grow, even if they make you bang your head against a wall. Mine's already halfway shaped. It should probably go without saying, but when you're working with live edge timber, you actually need to clean up the live edge. It doesn't come ready straight out of the box. Or the tree, I guess. Normally you'd start by removing the bark, but in this case I think most of it had actually just fallen off naturally during the drying process. What's left here is mainly just the sapwood. You'll notice I'm being pretty aggressive here, removing any material that breaks away under pressure. That's actually part of my strategy for dealing with the edge. It's just not reasonable to expect fragile sections like these to hold up over time, so I'm basically trying to front load any damage that's bound to happen later. Once that's gone, I can work with the stable material that's left behind. For this kind of work, especially when you want to preserve the natural contours of the edge, I've found these nylon abrasive wheels to be invaluable. The first time I worked on a slab, I didn't know about them, and I ended up sanding the entire edge smooth, even though I really didn't want to. That can look nice, but I prefer keeping the edge natural. In this case, sanding it down, I think, would have been such a waste. Alright, if you're still looking at this slab and thinking, what the hell is that? Fair enough, let me explain. This timber bell was basically a big knotted growth on the tree. They're usually found as a rounded lump on the trunk or branches, and from the outside it just looks like a weird bump. But when you cut into it, you get this incredibly unique swirling grain pattern that you just don't find in normal straight grain timber. That's why bells are so prized by woodworkers and furniture makers. They're naturally chaotic, beautiful, and every piece is completely one of a kind. As for what causes them, a bell usually forms when a tree's under some kind of stress. It could be from an injury, a fungus, insect attack, a virus, or just a weird genetic mutation. Basically, you can tell it was going through something. Honestly, same. I found working with this bell to be a bit unpredictable. It was unstable in areas full of voids and surprises, and because the grain runs in all directions, it would have been very difficult to use hand tools on. Still, for all the trouble, there's nothing else quite like it. So maybe surprisingly to you, this timber is actually pretty commonly used in the construction industry where I live. It's called Blackbutt. A weird name, I know. Apparently it's called that because the bark at the base of the tree, its butt, is often charred and blackened from past bushfires. Anyway, it's one of the go-tos for structural applications in framing out buildings. This is because it's fairly durable, has a good strength to weight ratio, and is fairly abundant in the region. I'll say the bits on construction sites are usually not as figured or as interesting as this slab. It can often look a little plain, to be frank, and that's why I believe many people might pass on it for furniture. It can go well in more basic pieces, but it usually lacks the figure and rich colours of other available timbers. I'd compare it to something like white oak in that it's good for simple designs, but it typically won't knock your pants off. I had the help of the timber yard owner when I was shopping for this slab. He was actually quite helpful and pointed this one out when I mentioned I was making an oval coffee table. I knew the bell in the slab was a really striking feature and would work beautifully with the curved tabletop the client wanted. Maybe he was thinking the same thing, or Maybe he just wanted to get rid of it, since he did mention it had been sitting there since they took over from the previous owners years ago. I'll just assume we were on the same wavelength though. As we looked over it, he kept saying I'd need to flood the burl with epoxy if I wanted to use it. And to be honest, part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe the burl was too fragile to survive without it, but I can't stand working with epoxy, and I much prefer using joinery and inlays to fix up slabs. I probably would have told him that, but epoxy's as divisive as politics, so I figured I'd just save myself the hassle. So yeah, they told me I needed epoxy. I had other ideas. The top of this slab had already been surfaced at the timber yard to remove the chainsaw marks from milling, whereas the underside was still pretty rough. Normally I'd try and bring both sides to a similar level of finish, but in this case I would have had to remove so much material to get below the chainsaw marks that it just didn't seem worth the time or losing that much thickness in the slab. After all, this will be a coffee table. It'll sit low to the ground, and outside of this video, it's pretty unlikely anyone's going to see the underside unless they go looking for it. I'll do my best to make it presentable, but mostly I just want it smooth enough that if someone runs a hand underneath, it doesn't feel like a total dog's breakfast. It's not something I like doing, but you do see this kind of thinking a lot in woodworking. More time and effort usually goes into the show faces. Like for example drawer fronts, which are often nicer than the rest of the drawer where simpler joinery or cheaper timber might be substituted. These are the kind of things I was telling myself while I stood there still picturing how good it would look if I made the surface perfect anyway. I don't think I would have felt comfortable taking on this burl slab project even a year ago. I've learned a lot of what I know just by watching videos, but that can only take you so far. Over the past year, I've gained a lot of hands-on experience working with slabs and learning to navigate their quirks. But I think the confidence I feel also comes from figuring out how to get the most out of the tools I use and also discovering some new ones. I remember when I first started making things, every new tool I learned to use felt like it unlocked some new possibility. It's an addictive feeling, and there's something incredibly rewarding about looking at a project that would have stumped you before and now knowing exactly how to tackle it. Going back to how I learned most of what I know from videos, there's been a real knowledge gap when it comes to working with slabs the way I want to. So much of the content online revolves around using epoxy to handle the flaws of a slab, and while that works, it's not the direction I want to take. Just to be straight, I don't think I'm doing anything revolutionary by not using epoxy. This kind of furniture existed long before it, but there just aren't that many people showing the process without it. I'm still figuring it out as I go, but if sharing that helps someone else, then it's worth it. For the curved cut on the slab, I tried to get it as close to perfect as I could with my jigsaw, which honestly is asking a miracle from it. After that, I had planned to come back in with the belt sander and shape the edge properly, using a square to make sure everything was actually square. Now, the way I probably should have done this is by making a template. In woodworking, you'll often see people cut out curves and circles by creating a template in another material and then using a router bit with a bearing that perfectly transfers that shape onto the workpiece. That method is super reliable and gives you a repeatable and accurate result, but I don't really do it that way. For starters, I don't actually have the right router bits to make that possible, which fair enough, easy fix. But more than that, I just find that way of cutting timber to be a bit boring. It puts too much distance between me and the piece I'm working on. Once the template's done, literally anybody of any skill level could come in and make the exact same cut. I guess I just like the process to feel a bit more involved. I sanded these sections in to better blend the curve into the live edge. I didn't initially cut them with the jigsaw because that would have been an unstable cut. As to the process of cleaning up the jigsaw cut, I can check each section of the curve and mark along it where material needs to go to fix any deflection that was in the jigsaw blade. When sanding, I can also make slight adjustments to the overall shape to bring it closer to being perfect. I'm using a 40 grit belt here, which is fairly aggressive, but it lets me shape the piece quickly. If you're doing something similar and feeling less confident, I definitely recommend starting with a finer grit and taking a more conservative approach. Shaping like this can get away from you fast, so it's important to check your progress often and make sure you're not going overboard. Just like the other side, there was one more corner I wanted to blend in. Doing this helped give the slab a more distinct form, and as a bonus, it left a nice extended transition from the live edge into the curve, something I wasn't expecting to like as much as I did. I'm doing something a little different with the inlays for this table, and because of this I'm going to need to get the top more or less finished now. I worked through 40 to 120 grit with the belt sander to get a fresh slate and remove any marks from when the slab was flattened. Then I came in with a fine grit abrasive wheel to do a final polish up on the voids. If I leave this step until after sanding, the extra polishing tends to show up on the flat surface as sheen, which I don't want. But if I skip it entirely, the edges of the voids will end up quite sharp from sanding the top down, so it's a bit of a balancing act. Next I brought out the orbital sander, starting back at 80 grit to remove any marks left by the belt sander. A belt sander is great for tackling the rough work quickly, but it can leave behind some pretty aggressive scratch patterns if you're not careful. So it's important to take the time to clean those up properly. From there I worked my way up through the grits to 320 to finish the top. I did consider trying to plane or scrape the top to a finish, but the burl was just something that felt a bit out of my wheelhouse, so that's why I'm just sanding this piece. For the edges, I switched to a sheet orbital sander. It's a bit less cumbersome and gives me some more control. I worked through all the grits here too, but I'm not showing it because even I don't want to watch all that. At the end, I like to do a final once over by hand. It just helps to make sure I haven't missed anything, and if I have missed something, at least then I can pretend I meant to do it. While I'm at it, I also break all the corners with a subtle chamfer to prevent the edge fibers from splintering or chipping. This slab had a few problem areas I wanted to stabilize with inlays, but since inlays tend to draw the eye, I wanted to place them with a bit of intention. And because this slab already has a large burl as the defining feature, I definitely didn't want to distract from it. So I decided to have each inlay point towards the center of the burl, drawing attention in rather than away. This idea also worked out well because most of the areas I needed to address were already circling the burl. To keep things from feeling too busy, I chose simple rectangular block inlays. Clean, subtle, and not trying to compete with the natural shapes of the slab. I'm having these blocks inlaid to sit just proud of the slab. With so many voids, I didn't want them getting lost in the texture. This way they'll stand out and add to the overall depth. The downside to doing this is that proud inlays make sanding the surrounding surface much trickier. That's why I finished the slab sanding beforehand. Normally you'd leave it rough and flush the inlays later, which is much easier, but it's not really an option here. I was having some indecision with placing this last block. I wasn't sure if it was helping or throwing off the composition. It's not something I usually document because it's hard to convey, but I often find myself wrestling with decisions like these, especially if they'll permanently alter the slab. There's just no undo button. Once it's done, you've got to live with it. I think it's a good thing to feel the weight of these choices and take a pause. They are impactful, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't frustrating. There were points in this build where I felt completely stuck, not because the work was hard, but because I kept stopping to make sure I was doing the right thing. And weirdly, I found the hardest part of these inlays isn't the technique, but having the confidence to follow through with an idea when the outcome isn't guaranteed. I think I should say up front, me not using epoxy has a lot to do with my own design philosophies. I've always really appreciated designs that honestly reflect the materials they're made from, and not just that, but also respect those materials for what they are. I don't believe there's any need to force something as inherently imperfect as a timber slab into some idealized version of perfection. There's a kind of beauty in the flaws. You could easily argue the burl in this table is technically a defect, and in a conventional sense you'd probably be better off with clean, straight-grained timber. But that's exactly what makes this slab interesting. It's the irregularity, the thing that breaks the rules, that gives it presence. That's what I want to highlight and not hide. And for me, bringing epoxy into the equation often feels like adding a material to mask or overwrite what's already compelling. In the worst cases, it doesn't just cover a flaw, it competes with the timber for attention. I'd rather let the wood speak for itself. The insistence at the timber yard that I'd need epoxy on this build, plus all the comments thanking me for not using epoxy on my last table, even though I never mentioned it, really got to me. It seems like, at least online, the default approach for live edge work now is to use epoxy. Honestly, it blows my mind how much epoxy has become the norm in woodworking. For context, big surprise, the guy who makes woodworking videos also watches a lot of woodworking videos. And I can tell you, the majority of slab builds you see online involve someone filling every little hole and crack with resin. From big creators to small hobbyists, it's everywhere. And look, I get it, watching epoxy pours is one of those oddly satisfying things that pulls in viewers. I'm guilty, those videos were a big part of what first got me interested in woodworking. However, it feels like people are using epoxy now just because that's what they've seen. There's no real thought behind it. And what's more, epoxy tables have become so mainstream that for most people outside of woodworking, it's now the first thing they mention when they see a live edge slab. What really disappoints me is that incredible live edge pieces, where the wood's natural shape does the talking, are now overshadowed by flashy resin pour videos. I find that stuff pretty boring these days. This table isn't about following that, and it's fine if you don't like it. It's just about showing there's more to woodworking than epoxy. I'd say this was the hardest inlay I've ever done. The timber was so thin and brittle, I wasn't sure it would survive. It also crossed several deep voids, meaning any gaps in the joinery here would be very obvious. I wanted to use the router to remove most of the waste, but it's risky here. Routers can easily tear out unsupported edges, and almost all of this material is unsupported. Still, with very shallow passes, it was my best option for limiting damage. For the crisp inlay borders though, I had to use chisels, and that's where things got tricky. The wood is so hard it needs real force, but the burl is riddled with voids, so instead of shaving cleanly, it's very likely to break apart. Here's a free tip for you. If you can see the floor through your table, you've probably gone too far. Other than that screw up, I found that slicing with the chisel rather than tapping it with a mallet gave the best results here. It's painfully slow, but much better at preserving the material. Luckily, while a few small breaks did happen, most were hidden, and anything visible blends so well into the surrounding texture that it's basically unnoticeable. I think you'll notice I'm generally pretty conservative with using glue on these inlays. And that's not because I'm cheap and want to save on glue. Well, I am, but it's more because the glue squeeze out on areas like this becomes very difficult to clean up. The nylon abrasive wheels I use can help if the area is accessible once the glue is dried, but that's not always the case. I also find that getting the glue off before it dries is so much easier and better as it doesn't penetrate as deeply into the wood where it can affect the eventual finish. Something I've discovered on this build, and I'm going to claim as my own method because I've not seen anyone do it yet, is wrapping some cloth over these pick tools to clean the glue squeeze out right into the fine detail and joinery lines. I'm really hoping that's an original trick and I haven't just reinvented the wheel. I aligned this inlay perpendicular to the center of the table, a deliberate break from the layout of the others. I couldn't find a way to make it sit naturally with their orientation, and rather than force it in and dilute the design, I wanted this one to feel clearly separate. Normally I like inlays to follow the grain so they feel more organic, but in this case I leaned into a more geometric, intentional placement to set it apart. I did briefly consider skipping this inlay altogether, but the area felt too fragile. I also didn't want to cut this off and fake a live edge. That kind of thing rarely looks convincing, and I think it often ends up feeling really gimmicky. I just want to quickly address something that's been bothering me. I've done a handful of rectangular inlays and slabs before, and I often get people telling me that I should be using bow tie inlays instead, for the mechanical advantage of holding a crack together. And while those comments aren't technically wrong, a bow tie shape is slightly stronger than a straight block. I really do need to emphasize, slightly. They're really not as far apart in strength as people seem to think. Most of what actually holds a joint like that together is the wood glue. The shape of the inlay only gives a minor advantage. Don't believe me? Look it up. And if I see anyone drop that in the comments again, I will get you and it will look like a bloody accident. Hearing me complain about epoxy woodworking videos might make you think I'm trying to throw shade at specific creators. I promise you, I'm not trying to. I really don't care that much. And I get it, epoxy videos perform and chasing views is part of the game. Honestly, I'm basically doing it myself in a roundabout way with this video. I'm talking about epoxy because it's still trending in woodworking, and I know that throwing in my 2 cents will probably get a bit of attention and stir up some debate, which is good for me because it helps with engagement and all that nonsense so that more people will find my work. But I'd be kidding myself if I didn't also acknowledge what I'm seeing in my own comment sections and give it a voice, because it seems like the perspective I've noticed isn't really well represented or rather reflected in the work being put up online yet. From what I can tell, there's a decent chunk of woodworkers, or maybe just a more hardcore woodworking audience, if that's a thing, who are honestly sick of watching epoxy being used in woodworking videos. Which I think I understand. I often find it really annoying to click on a video thinking it's more about wood, hoping to watch someone work with and design around a natural material. And then they'll suddenly switch to pouring a man-made material halfway through. It can feel like a cop-out. There's also the environmental implications that come with using resin that could be putting off viewers, but I don't think that would be the main cause. In fact, I don't know why I don't just ask. If you feel like you are one of these viewers, can you let me know your reasons for being against it? I guess what I'm trying to say with this is that even though epoxy has been a major driver of views in woodworking, it's pretty clear to me now that there's also an active audience that's just totally over it. And as someone who's more interested in the wood itself, I think it would be a great shift if that was actually reflected in the work we see. Now, obviously most slabs need some level of repair before they can become a usable piece of furniture, and I won't deny that epoxy can be an incredibly effective way to deal with those issues, but when I'm making repairs, I don't want to hide them. I want to draw attention to them. That's why I love doing inlays. They don't just stabilize the wood, they highlight the area and give me a chance to showcase some craftsmanship. For me, every repair is an opportunity. It's a chance to engage with the part of slab work I enjoy most, responding to the unique challenges of each piece. When I repair a slab, I want it to be a collaboration with the wood. And when repairing with an inlay, I get to leave a small signature, a mark of authorship. Don't get me wrong, I know epoxy done well takes real skill and knowledge, but a perfectly executed epoxy crack fill is often so clean, so invisible that it draws no attention. You only notice it if something goes wrong. It might make me a bit vain, but I don't necessarily want the work I do to go unnoticed. If I've spent hours solving a problem, I don't mind if it shows, and I would hope that it reflects the care put into the piece. With all the inlays in, or so I thought, I did the final hand sand of the top, making sure to get into the corners of the inlays. At this end of the table, there was a rather large chip out right next to a concerning crack. The kind of situation I reckon even a doctor would avoid, gloves or not. I wasn't comfortable leaving it, as it really interrupted the clean, shaped curve of the table. Early on, I considered cutting a piece from the offcuts of the slab to try and match the grain and go for an invisible fix. But given the crack was just a bit too large to cover subtly, I decided to lean into it instead. I wanted to make it obvious and try something new. I'm patching it with another protruding inlay, but since it's right on the corner, I wanted to challenge myself by having it extend both above and to the side. Chopping into the side of the slab like this adds a bit of complication. You've got to be careful not to split the timber as you work into the end grain. For this one I removed most of the material top down and then cleaned up the sides when I was fairly close. That helps to control what would otherwise be a somewhat sketchy cut. I should say the wood I've used for all the inlays on this table is spotted gum. It can vary a lot in tone, but I've deliberately selected darker brown sections of the boards that I had so that the inlays would contrast nicely against the lighter brown Blackbutt tabletop. Unfortunately, the router ended up chipping out the bottom of the joint, but I jammed some material in at glue up to try and help fix that. This block needed to be held in place while the glue cured. This would have been a pain with clamps, but masking tape did the job more than well enough. Lastly, I just needed to chop out this small patch job. I don't believe I've seen an inlay done quite like this before. I find the way it pokes out to be satisfying in a weird way, but I also recognize it might look a bit strange. Let me know what you think. Other than a few minor things, the work on the tabletop was now finished, so it was time to start working on the base. I'm going to use this offcut from the tabletop to make the table base, which was the plan from the start and part of why this slab felt pretty much destined for the design I had in mind. But just like the top, one side of the slab was in rough shape. Flattening it properly to remove all these marks would have cost me way too much thickness, and I couldn't afford that. I went at it pretty aggressively with low grit belts, but I quickly realized I'd have much better luck with my scrub plane to smooth out the transitions to the deepest chainsaw marks. Traversing across the grain like this with the scrub plane lets me take off large amounts of material without worrying that the blade will dig in with the grain and pull chunks out. If you want to drop your gym membership for a one-time payment, I'd definitely recommend picking up one of these tools. After planing, I sanded out the scallops left by the scrub plane. As you can see, even with going so aggressive, there are still chainsaw marks at the lowest points. I did some targeted work with a card scraper to get into the deepest sections, and then I worked outwards, blending the low areas with the surrounding surface. I've got to say, I really wouldn't recommend taking this approach to the extreme that I've done here, but in this case the slab is mainly going to be structural. The unevenness shouldn't be noticeable, and I just need this face to look presentable where it sits under the table. So maybe a bit of a weird choice, but I'm actually going to keep the shape of this chainsaw cut on the slab in the final piece. I could have refined the edge profile slightly, but I was already pushing it in terms of how much material I could remove while still supporting the top. Although honestly, I just kind of like the shape. It felt more dynamic, like it had energy to it, and that's exactly what I'm going for with this base. I want it to feel dramatic, and the shape of it will be doing most of the heavy lifting there. With this angled cut and the curve on the opposite side, the base should almost feel like it's leaning forward to catch the top. That sense of tension, like it's in motion but still grounded, is exactly what I'm aiming for. I'm going to cut this side of the live edge off as it will rest against the tabletop, and having this flat will make it easier to join. I almost didn't show this, but after thinking about it, my stupidity might actually save someone from a kickback accident, so let's break it down. Firstly, I'd never normally make a cut this deep while plunging as quickly as I was with a track saw. That's just a recipe for exactly what happened. But as you might have noticed by now, I also film my work, and a slow and careful track saw plunge just isn't that flashy to watch. That said, still a dumb idea, won't be doing it again. What I think really caused the kickback though wasn't just the speed and the depth of the cut, it's that I also accidentally pushed the saw forward at the same time, which is a big no-no. All those things combined overloaded the saw, and my DAX. So yeah, do yourself a favor, go slow and save on some dry cleaning. I'm cutting an angle into the semicircle here to aid with the whole dramatic looking table base thing. I was trying to be careful not to cut too much material out at once, testing to see what actually looked good. You know, cut twice, measure once. With the shaping done, I gave it a real good discerning look before deciding I was happy to move on to the joinery. The legs and supports for this table base will be intentionally simple. With so much going on in the slabs, I wanted clean forms that wouldn't compete for attention. Same with the joinery, just strength and simplicity. Because the slabs are the star of the piece, my role isn't to steal the spotlight, it's to support it. I'm not trying to compete with the natural character of the wood, just guide it from rough material into something functional and beautiful. And to do that, well, you've got to let the slab lead the design. When I'm working with the slab, I try and let the wood guide the design, rather than the other way around. Each slab already has a form and a history which should dictate its use, especially if you're trying to preserve the live edge. And while that can be limiting in some ways, I actually find it rather freeing. I think anybody who has done some design work will know that limiting your options often actually promotes finding creative solutions, and can even help with idea overload. For me, a slab gives a starting point, where there's usually only a few natural ways a slab can be used if you're paying attention to its shape and grain. Now, epoxy can technically be used within that philosophy, but in large part, it lets you bypass it. It allows you to impose whatever idea you want. For example, cut the slab in half, shift it around, pour in some resin, and call it a river. The slab becomes more of a supporting actor than the lead, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not the kind of relationship I want with the material. I want the timber to have the first word, and I prefer my job to be responding and not overriding. This video is shamelessly brought to you by my Patreon. That's right, no VPNs, no dodgy mobile games, I'm just asking for your support. It takes me an embarrassingly long time to make these videos, but over on Patreon you can follow along in behind the scenes posts as the projects come together. And if you've ever wanted to snoop around my workspace, there's now a full unfiltered workshop tour live there right now, where I bear all of my workshop. I also upload these videos there with monetization turned off, so you can watch them completely ad-free, because if anybody is going to waste your time, it should probably be me. But more than anything, I would love to build an actual community on Patreon. The comment sections on these videos are great, but they're fleeting, and it's not really the right place for an actual discussion. Some of you messaged me after my last project saying it inspired you to make something, which, for one, is cool as hell. I hadn't really considered that these videos might lead to that. But I never got to see what you made. Patreon feels like the right place to change that, a consistent space for sharing projects, techniques, ideas, and just general nonsense. So if you like what I do and want to be part of it in a more direct way, your support over there helps keep me locked in the workshop, making stuff for your amusement. Thanks for hearing me out. These parts are how I'm attaching the base to the top. Not with joinery, just bolts. Here's why. In the past, I've used sliding dovetails cut into the underside of the slab to keep it flat and give a solid anchor point for the legs. But with the Burl in this tabletop, cutting into it felt like a big risk I didn't want to take. Burl just isn't as strong or predictable as the surrounding grain, and the chance of it becoming damaged was too high. Both cutting into it and then having the stress of another piece of timber tightly wedged in easily could have left me with an unfixable mess on the underside. Would I skip structural joinery on every slab? Absolutely not. I'm not just crossing my fingers and hoping it behaves. This slab is properly dried, and it's been sitting in my workshop long enough that if it was going to move, it would have done it by now. So I'm feeling confident that a few well-placed bolts and gravity will be enough to keep everything where it should be. Avoiding work is fine. Just add a dash of thoughtful explanation and no one will notice. I've just used the base to mark out all the spots for the threaded inserts. They're simple to install, and using them means the base and the top can be separated, which is handy for transport and even more so if it ever needs repairs. I also made sure the holes through the base are oversized to allow for wood movement. It's not that the bolts aren't strong, it's that the timber doesn't care. If it needs to move and you don't let it, it will break things to do it. I like to add felt on the legs. Makes it easier to move, and let's be honest, no one wants skid marks on anything. I did a test fit before the final glue up of this coffee table, and something became apparent. The table legs were too bulky and didn't seem to fit in as they commanded too much attention. The client, on seeing them, suggested cutting them with a curve to reduce the visual weight, and after some consideration I actually agreed. I'd drawn up a few designs for the legs, but they were all based on straighter lines and blockier forms. I decided to start with a design that I had, as that left the most material intact so I could work backwards if needed, trimming and refining the shape as I went. However, I hadn't really considered a curved option. Curving the legs would really soften them and help tie them back into the rounded cuts on the slabs. Honestly, I should have considered it from the start, but that's the kind of beauty of designing for someone else. It forces you to take paths you wouldn't have chosen on your own, and in doing so expands your toolkit. I've got a love-hate relationship with doing this. Yes, it's satisfying to brand something I'm proud of, but it also kind of terrifies me. It's one of the last steps, and it's also one of the easiest places to screw it up. Too hot, too cold, or too long, and suddenly my brand could look like a permanent flaw on the piece. But hey, it turned out perfect, so let's just pretend I'm a pro and move on. After that, I like to stamp the year. With these stamp punches, I found the trick is to hit them lightly a bunch of times. It gives a way more consistent result than trying to whack it hard once or twice. You know, now that I'm saying it out loud, that wasn't even meant to be an innuendo. These are such small details that are unlikely to be seen, but for me it makes it feel complete. Everything's finished now, so all that's left is to put the base together. If you've hit a point in your life where you can't feel anything anymore, can I recommend gluing up a table while filming it? Have you been scrolling through videos looking for something, anything, to actually engage you? Try gluing up a table while filming it. Each glue up is a thrilling race against time as you attempt to align a camera and 30 kilograms of hardwood into the right position before it permanently sets in the wrong position. Dead inside? Not for long. With gluing up a table while filming it, you'll get sweaty palms, a rapid heart rate, a table, and a video of a table. It won't fix your problems, but for 15 minutes you won't be able to think about anything else. So yeah, I wasn't exactly thrilled to do this part. I knew from the dry fit earlier that the joints were decent, but there was still enough play that if I didn't get the table glued up quickly and set in the right position, I would risk wasting a whole lot of wood and woodwork. That's wordplay, by the way, high level stuff. And of course, trying to capture multiple camera angles of each step doesn't exactly make that easier. I was stressed for sure. Instead of clamping the whole thing, I used the weight of the tabletop to hold the joints while the glue dried. Bonus, it also let me check the table would sit right. After checking, I only had to tweak the base slightly. The workshop floor's not actually level, it slopes a bit, but if the bubble reads the same on the floor and the tabletop, I know they're in the same plane. So it might not actually be level here, but it's level in spirit. This is the moment I could have completely ruined this table. I'm using steel wool to apply the oil. Not as fast as a rag, but it does buff to a much nicer sheen. That said, I'll admit it's practically impossible to see the difference as I apply the oil. So I shot a quick test without oil just to show the before and after. And to preempt anyone who thinks I'm wasting my time. Now, the risky part, steel wool can react with the wood and permanently stain it. This timber, Blackbutt, is packed with tannins. They're natural chemicals in the wood, and when they mix with iron and moisture, you can get deep black, blue, and grey blotches across the surface. I've seen it happen to this timber just from water alone, so adding steel wool into the mix felt like a gamble. To be safe, I ran some tests on scrap pieces beforehand. I let water sit on them for about 30 minutes, and nothing. I already know that if water sits on this timber for too long, thanks to the tannins, it will discolor regardless. But I was expecting the steel wool to speed that up. With what I found, I think the polish it gives is worth the risk. If you've watched my other videos, you know I'm a fan of natural finishes. My go-to has been a mix of tung oil, mineral turpentine, and liquid beeswax. Something that a couple of you have mentioned to me, and I do really want to try, is swapping out the terps for D-limonene. It's a natural citrus-based solvent that would better align with the kind of finish I'm aiming for. The only reason I haven't made the switch yet is because I've still got a few litres of terps left to get through, and I hate wasting material. But if you want to try this and mix your own finish, I think D-limonene is 100% the direction I'm going to go long term. On that note, I've also started to explore other natural finish ingredients, and carnauba wax is next on my list. It's the hardest natural wax, so it should offer more scratch resistance than beeswax alone. It also buffs to a much higher gloss, which could be really nice in the right context. If you've used carnauba in your own finish though, I would love to hear how it went. Any tips, ratios, or regrets, please feel free to share. Before I oil the top, which I know we're all waiting for, I wanted to do things in the right order and hit the underside first where it connects to the base. If you leave a big surface like that bare, it can move differently to the rest as it absorbs and releases moisture, and that can lead to the timber warping. Also, can I just ask that we ignore all the crap I have all over the back of my shirt for the rest of the video? That was not a fashion choice I made knowingly. Now if I ever do a merch drop, I'm gonna have to sweep the floor and throw it in your package. I know this will come up, and look, I'm not an idiot, at least I hope not. I fully understand that filling the voids in this slab with resin would result in a more ideal surface for a tabletop, practically speaking. But if you actually stop to think about the types of objects that go on a coffee table, cups, plates, books, you'll realize the small holes around the burl won't actually cause any issues. If this was something different like a writing desk, sure, some filling or patching might be necessary. As for the larger voids, maybe a person using the table will have to apply a bit of critical thinking when placing their mug. And to that, I'd say a brain is biodegradable, epoxy isn't. I also want to say that I get that epoxy could have helped stabilize those fragile areas I removed earlier. That process was definitely time consuming and fiddly. But so is a resin pour, arguably more so, and especially on a surface this textured. And the way I handled it let me engage with the timber more directly, which is, for me, half the fun. When I build furniture, I'm always thinking about how it'll live beyond me. I want to make pieces that feel timeless, something that can exist quietly in a space for decades without feeling like a trend. But it's not just about looks, I also care about repairability. If a piece gets damaged, I want it to be easy to fix. That means using joinery, traditional finishes, and avoiding materials that complicate future work. And yes, that's part of why I'm hesitant to use epoxy. While it can solve a lot of problems in the short term, it's not easy to remove or repair down the line. Once it's in for good, and there's just not really that much evidence out there that shows epoxy can age gracefully. And that's important to me because I also really appreciate the beauty that comes with the age of a piece. A surface that's picked up a few scratches or wear marks isn't ruined, it's earned. I want my pieces to invite that kind of relationship, where someone sees the history in them and likes them more for it. That's not to say I want things to look rough, just that I don't mind when a table starts to show signs of life. I would hope that the things that I make get used and don't stay frozen in the moment they were made. So, here it is, the table I was told I had to use epoxy on. No resin, no rivers, just working with the flaws instead of hiding them. It's not perfect, and that's kind of the point. If you've followed along until this moment and haven't just skipped to the end, can I just commend your unfried dopamine receptors? And if you have skipped to the end for the final reveal, this table was effortless. I didn't make one mistake, and if you believe that, you're exactly the kind of viewer I need around here, so hit that subscribe button. If you still want more, have a look back through my other builds. If you like this one, you'll definitely like those. Also, if there's a bit of silence after this one, don't stress, it just means I'm buried in the next build. If you want to follow along while I'm off the radar or see what's coming up, that's what the Patreon's for. Thanks for watching.